people will say that to me because they'll say, well, your show says he's not like most Calvinists. He's nice. Nice is not a fruit of the Spirit. And I say, yeah, well, neither's being a jackass. So,
You've seen me talk about theology from a golf cart, and you know I love Squirrelly Joe's coffee. Well, taking inspiration from Jerry Seinfeld's Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee, I've decided to do a new segment on the channel, Pastors in Golf Carts Drinking Coffee. Today, I welcome Pastor Kenny Roberts of Missionway Church. Kenny and I have been friends for years, and he's been a frequent guest on the YourCalvinist Podcast. Like me, Kenny is a Calvinist. So we're going to discuss this question. Is cage stage Calvinism a real thing? Let's go for a ride.
Come on! Well, brother, I have just finished up a series on the 5 points of Calvinism. And just for the record, you are a Calvinist.
I am.
And how long have you been a Calvinist? That's a good question. Were you a Calvinist when you got saved, or did you?
No, I would say that probably around my time in college, which was 2008, 2009 timeframe, is when I began exploring the doctrines of Calvinism. And so it was kind of, if I can use the word progressive, move for me, shift in my theology where it just took some time. I don't like the word progressive with theology, but that was the word that came to mind. And I think you know what I mean by that.
Sure. And that's the thing, like people talk about covenantal theology, and my perspective would be what's now being called progressive covenantalism. Right. And I hate it. I hate that it's called progressive.
We need a different word.
We do. Absolutely. Absolutely. So how long ago was that? How long were you in college?
So 2008, 2009, I'm terrible at math. What's that, 15 years now? Almost? Yeah.
But that was right around the time of the Calvinism, I don't know what you call it.
Young Restless Reformed, yeah. Yeah, I think, and that had a pretty big influence on my life. I mean, not everybody, a lot of the guys at the college that I was at, Word of Life Bible Institute at the time, were kind of watching these videos, and Paul Washer's shocking youth message, I think, was around that time, or at least it was being watched a lot at that time. And so there was a lot of that influence that happened, and it just, I didn't even necessarily go searching for it. It just kind of found its way on my doorstep, and which is appropriate, I would say, due to predestination and all that.
If God found you. The truth found you.
That's right.
Well, one of the things that is often, I don't want to say accused, because I think it's actually true, so it's not just an accusation.
Sure.
But one of the things that's often recognized in people who are newly Calvinistic or young in their Calvinism, especially in that time period, was something that has been labeled cage stage Calvinism.
Yeah.
Now, for those who don't know, cage stage Calvinism is, the joke is, when someone becomes a Calvinist, you should put them in a cage because they're very dangerous. They're very excited to talk about Calvinism. They're very excited to talk about their theology. And they're dangerous because they usually want to talk about more than they actually understand.
Yeah.
And so it's better to just put them in a cage and let them simmer rather than letting them go and, harm, as it were, the truth.
Yeah.
So do you have an experience with that? First, let me ask, do you think that's real?
Mm-hmm.
And do you have an experience with that?
I do think it's real. And I don't think it's necessarily exclusive to Calvinism. But as I've thought about it over the years, I think that there's a uniqueness with Calvinism because for a lot of people, myself included, when you have this moment of beginning to embrace those doctrines, you have this moment of, this is what I feel like I've been missing in my study and reading of the scriptures for so long. So there's an excitement. I mean, there's this immediate, finally, it all, and I'm not, if you're not somebody who agrees with the doctrines of Calvinism, I'm not saying this to slight you, but it's like the Bible finally makes sense. It just all finally just fits together. So I think you have
I've had a ton of people say that. I mean, interrupt you, but I've had a ton of people when I walk through them, how covenants work and how the scripture fits together in God's plan and His sovereignty. Yep. People just look at you and say, "This is what I've been missing." Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and you have the experience where you're talking with somebody about theology. You don't mention Calvinism or any of the well-known lingo, and they'll go, "Well, yeah, that's what I believe, but I don't agree with Calvinism." I'm like, "Well, you kind of just did." So I think you have
can be
that
a Calvinist and not use the title.
Exactly. I think there's a lot more of those people than they would care to admit, and so I think the cage stage is real. I think the other aspect of it, maybe I would add to it, is I don't believe it's always intended But a lot of times people in that phase come off as pretty unloving and lacking grace in their responses. And sometimes it's just their excitement, their passion for the truth, their desire to really communicate that to people, but not recognizing just how cagey they can come off sometimes. Yeah.
And I think some people, everybody has a different personality. And some people, when they hear something that it just sounds so true and so awesome, they feel like they need to push that on.
Everybody needs to know.
Yeah, you've got to know this.
Yeah.
And I remember once, now this was in 2005, I think. I was at the Ligonier Pastors Conference, which was the coolest thing. They don't do it anymore, but it was R.C. Sproul's idea to have this conference where only pastors could come, not wives, not kids, not staff. It was just pastors. And it was, I think they only took like 100 people. Like, it was very small.
Wow.
And you had to sign up a year in advance. You had to put a deposit of $100 down. When you got to the conference, they gave you a $100 gift certificate to the bookstore. So you literally paid nothing. You got $100 worth of books for your deposit.
Right.
And they even provided you a hotel room and food.
Wow.
It was the most...
They need to bring that back.
It was the most outstanding thing I've ever been in my life.
Yeah,
and
cool.
And it was, you got to sit like 10 feet from R.C. Sproul and Ligon Duncan and Steve Lawson, who was also there back in the day. But these guys were right there answering your questions. And I remember in between, I was very new to Calvinism at that time. 2005, 2006 was actually when I was studying it, but I was still learning.
Right.
And I remember sitting down and talking to this guy, and he's like, I just can't believe that anybody's not a Calvinist. I can't believe anybody could miss this. And I was like, well, how long have you been a Calvinist? 6 months. I was like, what?
That's the definition of the cage stage.
That's right. He's like, I can't believe anybody had missed this. How long have you been a Christian? Well, several years. How long have you been a Calvinist? 6 months. Well, you missed it. Like, for a while.
Yeah.
And I know you said you had a kind of an experience as well.
Yeah, I went through the cage stage, and I didn't think that I was, but part of my story is the context that I grew up in. So I grew up in the Bahamas, born and raised there. That's where all my family's at, and the island that I grew up on is very, it's a big Christian culture. I mean, when I was growing up, I wouldn't have really known anybody who would have said they were not a Christian. Now, not everybody was necessarily living truly in the Christian life, but everybody was saying, oh yeah, I believe in Jesus, he saved me, I prayed, all that kind of stuff. But Calvinism, and I didn't really know this growing up, Calvinism was a dirty word. I mean, it was like, you don't go there. We don't believe that. Matter of fact, I know some people who have said things along the lines of, they accused me actually when they discovered some of what I believed of being an atheist for being a Calvinist, and I thought,
really,
okay,
interesting.
I don't know how that works, but okay. So that context, and then I go back from college as a youth pastor, and my goal was not to convince anybody of Calvinism. Truly, I didn't even realize how big of a deal it was there at the time. Maybe I should have, but I didn't. And I just thought, man, I've learned some really cool things that I want to share. And as I realized some of the animosity, I began to be somewhat careful. But I'll never forget, I had this moment where I said, you know what? I'm not going to be ashamed of this anymore. I'm not going to hide this. I want people to understand what I believe. I'm not trying to change them necessarily, but I want to share. And I wrote a blog post titled, I believe the exact title was, Why I Love the Doctrine of Predestination. And I didn't think anybody read my blog, but apparently they did. Because
you found out.
Because I heard a lot. I got a lot of comments on that. And, I did my best to follow up with a lot of people and have some real good conversations, and it ended fairly well. But I realized very quickly my tendency to just kind of want to rise up and go, well, why are you accusing me of being wrong when I just think you're wrong? It was kind of a messy time, and I took the article down just because it was causing more contention than it was doing good, and really learned from that phase. So it wasn't necessarily full on like I'm trying to make everybody a Calvinist. It was more so like I just really want to share this, and I don't want to hide it anymore. I don't want people to not know where I stand on these issues, and so that was a fun time.
Do you think that it would be safe to say that one of the reasons why, especially in that time period, there was so much cagey or cage stageness that rose is because a lot of guys felt like they were pushing back against the shallowness and maybe some of the superficiality that they somehow had to grow up under.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of factors. Honestly, I think it's that coupled with this is also the rise of the internet at the same time, coupled with the fact that this was also kind of the peak of the church growth movement. So you bring together the desire to fight against the shallowness, the rise of the church growth movement, which pushed more of the shallowness, I think, overall, and the rise of the internet age and more information and more preachers that you can listen to, like all that together with a generation that just kind of tended to be more vocal and passionate and push against things. I don't know, all those factors, I think, kind of mixed together to bring about this perfect recipe for the cage stage, if you will.
Yeah. And it's interesting because all those things that you just mentioned, it is a weird perfect storm that happened in the mid 2000s. YouTube started.
That was huge.
And I'll tell you an interesting story. I did a series of videos, and it was defending the doctrine of predestination. So it's similar to your story that you had was an article.
Yeah.
Well, I've always been sort of a better talker than a writer.
Right.
So I just turned on a camera in 2006 or 2007, somewhere around in there, and I defended the against the most common accusations of Calvinism. Right. Calvinists don't evangelize. And I was like, well, that's not true.
Right.
Or Calvinists don't believe that Calvinists believe men are robots and don't have a will or have an ability to make choices. Well, that's not true.
Yeah.
And so, but here's the thing I did, and this is an interesting sort of another side story, is, rolling stop. Somebody's going to call me out for that.
I won't.
By the way, we almost got totally backed into by a truck. Like
Keith did some secret maneuvering that you did not see on the camera.
that guy did not know we were there. So praise the Lord, we are safe. But anyway, so I made a video responding to the accusations of Calvinism, but here's what I did wrong. I was trying to be cool and make the video look cool, so I put it in black and white.
Yeah.
And I was wearing a black t-shirt with a sort of black background.
Yeah.
So it was just a white face with a black everything, and I looked like Anton LaVey, and I missed it. And if you don't know who Anton LaVey is, he's like the head of the Church of Satan. so some people saw it, and they were like, this is the most devilish thing I've ever heard. You look like the devil. And I was like, oh my gosh, that was not my intention at all.
I was trying to be edgy, and you did
I was trying to be cool.
Too well.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's where I guess both of us had a similar situation.
Yeah, and for me, I look back too, and here's another part of the cage stage that maybe took longer for me, was I kind of responded to that. I sort of retreated, and I said, okay, I'm in a context where I need to be careful about this. I'm not trying to, anytime people ask me about this, is like, I'm not trying to make you a Calvinist. That is not my goal at all. You're not going to hear me at my church do a sermon series on the 5 points of Calvinism in that way, because our church, we have a lot of people who disagree with Calvinism, and that's okay. We have conversations all the time where I'm like, we are brothers and sisters in Christ. Let's just be clear about that. But the Lord really had to bring me through that as a pastor, because as I retreated from that, kind of one of my thoughts was, well, if I'm ever a senior pastor of a church, everybody's going to be Reformed. Everybody's going to be a Calvinist, right? And
yes.
That is not the case in the context that God has placed me in now. And not only have I learned to be okay with that, but I've learned to love that, because we can sharpen each other. We can have good, meaningful conversations where we still walk away united in the faith. And I'm challenged to not just push my own theological understanding. I'm challenged to really teach the scriptures. So when I come to the first sermon series I did at Missionway was Romans chapter 8. And I came to, the golden chain of salvation in that series. And I thought, okay, I've got to preach the text as the text is without coming off as a cage stage Calvinist trying to push my opinion on anybody. And by the Lord's grace, I came out of that series. I don't know how many people would have even known I was a Calvinist yet coming out of that series, right? And it wasn't because I don't believe I taught it faithfully. It's just because my goal was not, let me make you a Calvinist. It was, let me teach the Word. So the Lord took many years to work me kind of through that, thinking that, well, if I can just have my own church as the senior pastor, then I can convince everybody to be a Calvinist, and we'll be good and all get along. But it did not necessarily work that way.
I would say, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. I would say, I know, and I know there are people at our church who aren't as firmly Calvinistic,
right?
And it's usually for one of two reasons. Either they have, to them it's not a big deal, so they just haven't gotten into that side of it, and that, I mean, there's just a lot of people that aren't. That's not their concern, right? They believe that what I'm teaching is the scriptures. They know I preach verse by verse. They're faithful attendees, listening to the Word, trusting in the Word, but they're not. That's not the hill they're looking to necessarily fight or argue about. And I think there are those who aren't necessarily Calvinist, but again, to them, it's not that they don't know. They know they aren't that, but they also know that we love them and we're faithfully seeking to preach the Word to them. And it's just not, again, it's not something that they're willing to walk away over.
I had a guy who wanted to leave the church because, he came to me one day and he said, I noticed some of the guys you quote. Are you Calvinist? And I told him, yeah. And, he said, that may be a deal breaker for me. And I said, well, for what it's worth, it's not for me. I mean, I have no desire to shove this down your throat. I have no desire to convert you to Calvinism. I do have a desire to teach the Word, and you have every opportunity to challenge me as I teach the Word. You have every opportunity to come to me and say, hey, you said this, I think this is wrong because of X, Y, and Z. Let's have those conversations. And he didn't necessarily see it fully that way, but that's been my opinion, I think, by God's grace, especially the last few years, where I'm like, I am not the poster boy for Calvinism. And what I appreciate about you is, as open as you are about this, that's not what you're trying to necessarily be either. And I that's why I love having conversations with you about this kind of stuff too. So,
well, the whole joke on my podcast is I'm not like most Calvinists. I'm nice.
Yes.
And that was a Lutheran
best line.
Who wrote that line, and I know why he wrote it. Because there are a lot of guys who just this is the thing. This is the only thing that matters. And if you're not this, then you're not on the same team. You're not together in the truth.
Yeah.
And I like I said, I've had to struggle with that because, people will quote Spurgeon a lot, and they'll say, well, Spurgeon said that, all Calvinism is the gospel. And I step back and I said, well, I don't know that I agree with Spurgeon, and here's why. I would say that Calvinism helps me understand the gospel better, but the gospel is that if you believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, you will be saved. I mean, in the simplest terms, if you have believed in the finished and completed work of Christ, not what you have contributed to your salvation, because you've contributed nothing but the sin that made it necessary, but if you believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and trust in his finished work, you will be saved. Now, if we disagree on eternal election and the sovereign decree of God and how the extent of the atonement, and even something as simple, for me, I think as simple as, that once you're saved, God will continue to keep you saved, perseverance of the saints. To me, those things help me understand the way God does it, but it doesn't mean that somebody who doesn't agree with me on those things doesn't believe the gospel.
No, I don't think you can say that. I mean, to use a specific point, like, I'll have conversations with people who don't believe in predestination with the nuance that I do, but they would still affirm that no one comes to the Father unless they're drawn, right? They would affirm those truths. Now, I think they're inconsistent in that, but they're not rejecting that truth, and they're not saying that, no, I found God, like I did this, like it was my work and my faith, like I'm better than everybody else. They're not saying that at all. If somebody is saying that, that's not a Calvinistic issue, that's a gospel issue. And so we need to be able to make those distinctions as we even pastor people in those conversations.
And to the person who is maybe new to Calvinism, I thought maybe we could both share sort of some advice to say, okay, maybe you're a little cagey, We've been there. We both shared, that. And what would you maybe say to your younger self if you were given that opportunity?
It's not as important to convince people of the doctrines of Calvinism as it is to disciple people in the Word. I think that we have this zeal. We go, man, I've finally seen things really clearly. And here's what we forget. Here's what I forgot. I forgot that I had been a Christian at that point for 15 years, and I didn't yet understand this or fully see this in the Scriptures. And we need to have patience with people. So I would say maybe two main points are, not everybody's going to agree with you on Calvinism, and that's okay. You should still be able to have unity with them. I would say even in the same church as them. And then number two, have patience with people. It may be that they're going to come to an understanding of these things, but it's going to take them time, just like it took you time, just like it took me time. And again, don't have it as your goal to turn people into Calvinists. Just teach the Scriptures. Let me tell you my hope. My hope is that if somebody were to ask me of my position in Calvinism and I explain it to them, they could say, well, I don't know that I would put that label on what I believe, but that's what I believe. Because I've had that happen many times where they say, I'm not a Calvinist. And then we talk about what we believe and we're like, we agree. Like we're saying the same things, There are some nuances that we'll have some disagreement on. But I think there's a lot more unity than disunity. That's maybe another point I would say is, not everybody is out to get you, because sometimes you can feel that way in the cage stage. That's an important point.
That's a good point. Yeah, it's seeing others as sort of an enemy to be conquered, rather than friends to learn with and grow with and share with and seeing I think that's a big problem, and maybe worth a whole other conversation. A big problem in particularly online Christianity is trying to find the enemies rather than trying to find the friends. And I know that there are people out there who we need to separate from. There are people out there who are teaching false gospels, or people out there who are making false claims. And we have to separate from nonsense. But, I've had guys on my show that I know are not Calvinists. David, Guzik, David Guzik. Dude's awesome. We came to Jacksonville and we had breakfast together. What an awesome dude. And he's Calvary Chapel.
Right.
And I know he's not a Calvinist, but he's a great guy.
I just heard about a Reformed Calvary Chapel the other day, by the way, just as a side note. I was like, does that exist?
Spicy.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
No, I was just going to add to that, too, that not everybody's out to get you. And we've got to be able to approach conversations with people where we understand that even if they disagree with me, they probably have something to say that I can learn from and grow in. Like, even if they adamantly disagree with some of the doctrines of Calvinism, they still have the ability to challenge me in my understanding of the Scripture. So why would I come at them in a combative way? Why wouldn't I want to ask questions? And if I really believe what I believe, and I do, and I'm firm in that, why am I so insecure as to think that if they disagree with me, we've got to duke it out? Like, we don't. We can talk. I can walk away. We can both walk away thinking the same things we did before, but being challenged to go deeper in our understanding of these things. So have that mindset as you approach those conversations too, I think really is important.
Absolutely. And that's super helpful. I want to offer one other just sort of experiential piece of advice.
Yeah.
I think the other reason, and you hit on something earlier I wanted to bring back up, and I think the other reason why we see cage stage Calvinism is because we tend to see cage stage anything people are passionate about.
Yeah.
And you said this earlier. It's just about like if you come to a new understanding of something, you want to tell everybody.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that in the mid-2000s, early 2010s, a lot of people were coming to understand things about Calvinism. Mm-hmm. Then it became presuppositionalism.
Right.
Then it became theonomy.
Yeah.
then it was like everything Jeff Durbin was doing. Everybody was like everybody's right behind him, like, bump, 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 like, keep going, Jeff. We'll keep after you, right? Like he was leading this pack, and every time I remember #precept. Everybody's like, oh, I went, and I would say, can you explain presuppositionalism? No, not really.
Yeah.
They didn't know. I mean, they may have read, an article by Van Til or half of John Frame's book or something, but they really didn't understand it. I remember that because I was teaching apologetics at the church. And somebody's like, oh, you better teach presuppositionalism. I was like, can you define it?
Yeah.
Would you know it if would you be able to distinguish it between classical apologetics? And anyway, the point is, there's something called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Are you familiar with this?
Go ahead. I believe so. It sounds familiar.
It was a study that was done, and I know somebody in the comments is going to want to correct, because I'm sure what I'm about to say may have a little incorrect information, but basically,
I'll believe whatever you say.
Well, I appreciate it. Somebody's going to say, "Well, that's not what happened," but apparently, a study was done. Dunning and Kruger were the names of the sociologists who were doing it. And I don't want to get in his way.
No,
There's a giant semi.
Yeah.
At least I know he has a stop sign. I'm going to go on past.
We've already almost died today. So
I don't want to do that again. He waved at us, so that's good. So the Dunning-Kruger effect says this. It says there's an arc of knowledge. When somebody first learns about something, they feel like an expert.
Yeah.
But the more they learn about that thing, the more they realize how little they know.
Yes.
And then they begin to actually learn. And so there's this curve.
Yep.
So like you first learn about something, you're an expert, then you realize you're not, and then you become more knowledgeable, and you end up being like a sage.
Oh man, I'm sorry to cut you off, but
no, please.
That is a big part of my experience too, with all of this, because I had that. Like, I thought Calvinism was just the 5 points of Calvinism. Like I didn't think about or study like how far-reaching this theology, this systematic approach to theology is going to take you. And so as I stepped into a senior pastor position, I had not yet deeply thought about the implications on the ecclesiology with the things that I said I believed, right? And so I wish, what I would say to my younger self is, spend some more time deeply studying these things. Really know what you believe. Don't just claim it because you think you agree with this and the people you like agree with this, and so just keep parroting what they say. Like, you need to be able to really articulate this for yourself. And so spend some time in the cage. It'd be good for you, is maybe what I would say.
Yeah, and that's the whole thing about, again, going to the Dunning-Kruger effect. The idea, when you are ignorant and spouting off, you sound like you know stuff.
Right.
And sometimes even the wisest among them can't refute them, because you have to know so much more to refute them that they sound so smart.
Yeah.
But they aren't.
Yeah.
And
it's almost like the Mormon missionaries who have been trained in what to say.
Yes.
And the minute you get them off script, they're like, I haven't really thought about that. Yeah.
And so, again, I think it can be anything. It can be Calvinism. In fact, I would say right now, and this is not to take a shot at any individual, because I have people in my life who I know, who I care for, who are in this position. But some of the loudest and most, if I would say, cagey people right now are the former Calvinists. These are people that became Calvinists during the Young Restless Reform, and now have become disillusioned with Calvinism for whatever reason. They just felt like it's not real or whatever. And there's a few people that I have in my mind, and some of these people immediately created YouTube channels, immediately got thousands of followers, immediately began to draw behind them these groups. And you listen to them, it's like, you still don't really know.
No.
You're again, you're in that bell curve position of the Dunning-Kruger. It's like, okay. And I said something on Twitter, made a lot of people mad. I said, no one loves talking about Calvinists more than a than the anti-Calvinist. Oh, that's not true. Calvinists talk about it all the time. I was like, look at my sermons for the past 5 years.
Right.
How many of them have really addressed the doctrines of Calvinism, doctrines of grace? Yes, I've done a few series here or there that specifically on sovereignty. I was invited to a church to do that. But in general, I'm just preaching verse by verse.
And it's going to color your preaching. Like,
sure, absolutely.
What I tell people is, you're not going to hear me do a sermon on the 5 points of Calvinism, but you do need to know that this is the theology that you're going to hear come through my preaching. Like, that's going to happen. And that's different than I'm trying to convince you to become a Calvinist. So, yeah, I would say one other point I was thinking about as we talk about like spend some time studying this and don't just create a YouTube channel and all these things. I would also say if you've recently become a Calvinist or believe you're beginning to embrace this doctrine and you're in a church that would not teach that, don't just immediately leave. I don't think that's wise. I think you should spend some time, again, first and foremost, studying this for yourself. If that church is faithfully teaching the gospel, let me make that caveat. If there's a faithful church, but they don't necessarily embrace the 5 points of Calvinism, don't just say, well, I'm out and I'm going to find a Reformed church. Spend some time studying, spend some time talking with the pastor, really digging deep into the scriptures and just, I don't know. I mean, I know that every situation is going to be different. I'm not trying to make a blanket statement, but I think a lot of times, guys, what they do is they hear this, they immediately cause division in their church, and then they leave. Yeah. So they leave behind them a wake of destruction that they don't even realize that they've caused, but they have caused it. And so avoid that at all costs as well as another piece of advice I think I would give.
Yeah, and what you just said, you caught me off guard because you said if you come to these knowledge, don't leave. I thought you were going to say don't be a jerk because that's what...
Well, that too.
Well, yeah, because some guys will they will immediately. I've had people send me emails. Hey, I recently came to the knowledge of the doctrines of grace. My pastor doesn't teach these things. How can I convince him?
Right.
I'm like, slow down.
Yeah.
like you've been a Calvinist for 5 minutes. Slow down. Yeah. It's again, that's the cage, right? Like, how can I convince my pastor, the man who's been shepherding my soul, who loves me, who was there when these things happened to me, and he's walked with me all these years? How can I go and just tell him how wrong he is? Rather than loving him and continuing to pray for him and maybe meeting with him and talking to him about these things. And maybe he knows more than you think he does. And maybe he actually believes closer to what you think than you think he does.
And what you should go to him with is not, hey, I want to convince my pastor to be a Calvinist. It's my pastor loves me and is shepherding my soul. I want to bring these things I think I'm seeing in the scripture with him, have him check my heart, check my understandings, have him shepherd me through this. Because I'm willing to bet that if he's a faithful pastor, even if he disagrees with the 5 points of Calvinism, is going to want to shepherd you through that. His desire is not going to be, well, let me just convince him that he's wrong. It's going to be, let's open the scriptures together and let's study this together. And I mean, that approach is eternally better than let me just convince him to be a Calvinist.
Absolutely. And as a pastor, I would be refreshed if a person came to me and said, hey, I've started to learn these new things. Can we walk through this together? Can we talk about this? And even if we ended up disagreeing at the end of the day, that is so much better than the person who just ghosts his pastor, who just ghosts the church because he came to some simple misunderstanding or not simple, simple disagreement about what the scriptures say. And maybe it's not simple. Maybe that's the wrong word. But they came to a disagreement. I think, and I've said this so many times on Friday Night Live, so I know people have heard me say it. I think the saddest thing as a pastor is, for me, is just how tenuous relationships can be because people will just walk away without a conversation, without any attempt to reconcile if there's been a hurt or anything like that. It's just, well, let's just go to another church. And it's like, guys, we really do love you. I really do love you. And if we disagree and it comes to a point where we can't continue to walk together for whatever reason, let's at least have a conversation about it.
And God has put that pastor, those pastors and elders in your life as a means of spiritual authority and guidance in your life. I think in some ways we are rejecting that when we just go, well, I've spent a couple hours studying this thing. I think my pastor's wrong, so I'm just going to walk away. That's I don't care what it is you're studying. I don't care what it is you've come to an understanding of. That is a dangerous, dangerous mindset. Because it's saying that I'm going to reject the spiritual authority that God has placed in my life before I even have a chance to hear them out, before I even give them a chance to shepherd my soul in the midst of this conversation. And that you're gonna find yourself hopping from church to church to church if that's how you treat things.
Yeah, absolutely. There's some guys out there, and I know we got to wrap this up, but there's some guys out there who say cage stage is not a thing. This never been a thing. It's good that young men are exuberant and excited about theology, and we should never crush a young man's spirit. We should encourage zeal.
Yeah.
You ever heard that?
Yep. Yep.
And why don't we finish this little ride? We're getting close to the end here. Why don't we finish with a thought about that? What would you say if somebody said, well, cage stage is a good deal, is a good thing?
Zeal is a good thing. What are you encouraging zeal for? Are you encouraging zeal for the gospel? Or are you encouraging zeal for your specific convictions within systematic theology? I mean, what do you want them to have zeal for most at the end of the day? And I would also say, yeah, zeal is a good thing, but zeal not according to knowledge is a very dangerous and even destructive thing. And even if they are right in the things that they are now believing, they may, as you already said, not have a deep enough knowledge for that zeal to be carried out in love and with grace and with truth. And they can end up causing more destruction than they do good when they've not had a chance to really bring some true, deep knowledge with that zeal. Don't lose the zeal. I mean, it's like my daughter. My daughter is a very strong personality. I don't want to crush that, but I want to guide her in that. And I want her to know how to exercise that within biblical womanhood. And so I think it's a similar conversation there.
I agree. And I think there's an old saying, it's about the balance of grace and truth. Mm-hmm. And basically, grace without truth is heresy. Mm-hmm. But truth without grace is destructive to the heart. Yep. You have to be able to balance that. And there's a better way of saying it. What was it? So grace without truth is heresy. Truth without grace is like, I forget. I've heard it before. It's another word, but it's the idea of it's destructive. Yeah. Grace or truth without grace. Truth without any grace. And that's the sad thing is we hold to what we call the doctrines of grace. Mm. And some among us are the most graceless people. Yeah. We should be the most graceful. Yep. We should be the most kind. We should be the ones who are, people say, well, nice is not a fruit of the Spirit. Yeah, well, neither's being a jackass.
Kindness is.
That's just it. Kindness is a fruit of the Spirit. People will say that to me because they'll say, well, your show says he's not like most Calvinists, he's nice. Nice is not a fruit of the Spirit. And I say, yeah, well, neither's being a jackass. So if I had to choose, I'm going to choose nice. That doesn't mean I don't speak the truth.
Absolutely.
But I'm going to choose to be nice.
Yep.
Well, brother, I want to thank you for coming along on this ride with me today. You're the official first of pastors in a golf cart drinking coffee. And to remind everybody, we are drinking today Squirrelly Joe's coffee. This is the best coffee in the world as far as I'm concerned. My wife loves it. Yeah. I hope you enjoyed it.
It's really good. It's my first time having it, actually. It really is very good. I'm going to have to order some now.
Well, good. And if you do want to order some, you can get a free bag by going to squirrellyjoes.com/YourCalvinist. And then if you decide to buy more, you can use my name, Keith, as a coupon code, and you get 20% off anything in the store. So again, thank you, Kenny, for being on the ride.
Thank you.
Thank you guys for riding with me, and I'll see you the next time I'm on the golf cart. God bless.